can. No, they can't hear me. Can we? Hello, testing 1, 2, 3. So much better. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and I'm here, much to my huge delight and surprise, with two pretty spectacular writers. They're both unconventional and daring. They've been brought together today under the title Early Triumphs because Eimear McBride, to my right, has made the most stellar impact with her first novel, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. She won the Goldsmiths Prize. She also won last year the Bailey Women's Prize for Fiction. She wrote the novel when she was 27 years old, but it was published, I think, 10 years later?
9 years later.
9 years later, after a series of rejections from very large publishing houses. We'll talk a little bit about that. And Eleanor Catton, to my left, who in 2013 won the Man Booker Prize for her novel, The Luminaries. It's her second novel. She was also 27 when she wrote it. And perhaps that's not relevant at all. We can perhaps talk about that too. Both, we hope, I particularly hope, have decades of novel writing still to come. A warm welcome to you both. For those who haven't read these books, I urge you to do so after this session. I'm going to very quickly outline what the books are about so that you can follow the discussion. Eimear's book, The Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, is it's a novel which conveys the protagonist's psychic collapse. The girl of the title is not named. Indeed, nobody in the novel is named. We're plunged into the girl's head, experiencing her world firsthand. Here are some of the things that happen in the story. There's a departed father, a pious, abusive mother, an errant and always blasphemous daughter, the girl of the title, a predatory uncle, a death in the family, and the girl's relationship with her brother, and the long shadow that's cast by his childhood brain tumour. But it's how we know these things which is its daring and startling achievement. It's written in a shattered language, fractured, no punctuation apart from full stops, very short sentences very often, inverted syntax, old words used in new and very surprising way. It is intense and hugely rewarding. Lots to talk about there. And Eleanor Catton's The Luminaries is also a virtuoso performance in its own way. It's set in 1860s New Zealand, the gold rush, and it's a doorstopper of a novel, if you haven't read it, 832 pages long. And boy, how those pages are organized. This is the other startling thing about it. On one level, it is a Victorian murder mystery. Drug dealers, prostitutes, prospectors, con artists, lots of secrets, big on plot. It's a huge page turner, but it's the elaborate organizing structure of this novel which takes you to a deeper level if you should so choose to go. It's structured according to very strict astrological principles. Each of the main characters is aligned with a star sign or a planetary body. Indeed, there is a character chart which lays this out for you, and each of the novel's 12 parts opens with an astrological chart illustrating the heavenly influences on these characters. So astrology also controls the chronology of the novel, and we'll talk about that, I suppose, probably first, Eleanor. Let's start with talking to you about the structure. It is, for me, and I read a lot of contemporary fiction, the most impressive structure that I've ever encountered in a contemporary novel. Do we have to understand the charts, the astrology, in order to get the most out of the narrative, do you think?
I hope not. It was always my intention with the book to try and create a fictional environment that could be read on a number of different levels, that could simply be enjoyed on the level of story, but where the reader would have a sense of all times of the structural integrity that lay behind what was being presented to them on the surface, I suppose, so that there was a terrestrial layer and also a celestial layer to the storytelling.
And what came first? Did the idea for the structure come first?
It did, actually, yeah. I was very early on in kind of dreaming up the book. I was thinking about some of my dissatisfaction with experimental fiction, or quote-unquote experimental fiction particularly of the 20th century, where it seemed to me that very often it was quite boring to read. The pleasures that plot affords we're very rarely sitting side by side with formal innovation and structural innovation. And so really the challenge that came first for me, the challenge that I set myself at the very beginning, was to see if I could try and do both. Try and have a novel that was enjoyable and engaging and fun to read, but at the same time investigative of form and challenging of a kind of a different way of storytelling.
And Eimear McBride, what about you? The idea of the language that you've chosen to write the narrator's voice in, was that something that came first before the idea of this story of the teenage moral collapse that we see?
I suppose, well, they came at the same time, although the starting point for me was also a lot of experimental fiction from the 20th century, which I felt had in some ways disregarded the reader and had asked them to do a lot of work, and there were a lot of rewards there, but sometimes not so many rewards there, not as many rewards as effort required to read them. And so I wanted to see if I could maybe use some of those techniques, but in a different way, instead of taking the reader far from the human experience, to bring them as close to the human experience as possible. And so for me, the language was about trying to express that experience at all times in its most basic way, and so that the reader would feel that they couldn't detach themselves from the main character. I wanted to see if it was possible for a reader to experience a story almost as though it was happening physically to them, inside them.
That certainly does happen in several really rather disturbing instances, which we'll talk about in a moment. But tell me about the moment at which, because you've mentioned this in an interview in the past, where you read James Joyce's Ulysses and everything changed for you as a writer. Explain that.
Well, I was starting a very boring temping job, doing records, data entry, at this terrible place, and I thought, what will help me get through? Maybe I'll read Ulysses. It's been sitting on my shelf for a long time, and now maybe it's time. And so I was living in Tottenham in London at the time, and I got on the train, and 20 minutes later I got off, and I knew that everything had changed for me just from reading those first maybe 5-6 pages of Ulysses. And it was as though all the words started to go around my head in a different way. That's all. The only way I can explain it was an almost physical experience of language. And so that was the beginning. From that point on, I knew everything I had written before was rubbish and had to go to the bin. And this was the beginning again. But at the same time, I would say I was never interested in trying to, imitate Joyce. But he opened the gate and he pointed the way. That was the importance of him for me.
For me, but I sense that both of these books have been hugely successful because...
Accurate is that all of the placements in the book, with the book begins, for example, with a character who brings a kind of mercurial influence, so the influence of reason and order and logic, and also trickery and deceit into the narrative. He enters the book and immediately in the first scene strikes up a conversation of a man of Sagittarian temperament, and the chapter is called Mercury and Sagittarius. On this day in Hokitika, the town in which the book is set, if you were to look up at the sky in the evening, you would have seen Mercury, in fact, in Sagittarius. So I don't really have a very good reason for having done this, apart from the fact that I wanted to see if I could. I think that it's very important to set yourself a challenge at the beginning of a creative project. I think if you know where you're going, you know the answer you want to find, your work will never live. It will never teach you anything, and you'll never be able to it's just surprise a reader, I suppose, because you're not surprising yourself in any way.
Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly find whenever I sit down to write something and I know what it is and where I'm going, it immediately dies on the page. Nothing can come out of it. I immediately lose interest, because for me it has to be an exploration. it has to take me on a journey as well as me trying to take the reader on a journey.
So the journey that you went on with this book, you wrote very, very fast. You wrote in 6 months. And given what I've already said about the nature of the language, the fractured, shattered syntax that you use, how much of that did you live in those 6 months the whole time? Because it's an experiential thing that you want us to feel, which I certainly did, but I wonder what impact it made on you then, living in this girl's head for the urgent way in which you did for those 6 months, which must have been very intense.
Yes, I would say it nearly ruined me, actually. And my husband, mercifully, was very understanding and just made me cups of tea and stayed out of the way most of the time. But yeah, I mean, you know, my background was in acting. That's how I originally trained as an actress and as a method actress, and so that is very interesting to me, that way of creating a character and that complete immersion in the character. And it's the only way I know how to build a character. And so I suppose, you know, I was method writing in a way, and I you know, I didn't think about anything else. I didn't talk about anything else. I didn't really do anything else for that 6 months. I was, you know, I felt as though I was in the midst of a swarm of bees, and I just was trying to find my way out, and when I found my way out, that was the end of the book.
But when you say you talked about nothing else, did you ever find yourself talking in her voice?
No, I think I was hopefully sane enough to stay away from that. It led to very complicated conversations,
yes,
I think.
No, absolutely. This idea of completely immersing yourself in her head, the experience for the reader is at times very disturbing and very painful. From the get-go, she speaks, you start the book with her writing as a child of 2, which in and of itself is extraordinary because she's attempting to navigate the world of an adult, and that's really difficult. And then we see her as a teenager and as a young woman. There are moments the moments that I found most disturbing were the moments of the sexual relationship with the uncle.
Yeah.
And I talk about it as a relationship as opposed to sexual abuse, because there's ambivalence at the heart of it. And your descriptions of it were so visceral. You talked about the smell of sex, the blood of sex. I wondered why you felt the importance to do that, to really make it real for us as a reader, as her experience as a young woman.
Well, I think that's because I do think of it as an abuse. And, you know, the girl is 13 when her uncle has sex with her. And so he rapes her. And although she's having sort of the first stirrings of desire and she fancies him. But he takes advantage of that and he rapes her. And later in the, you know, and from that point on, that informs the development of her sexuality and who she becomes. And she begins to use her sexuality in lots of different ways, most of which were not in the ways you would hope your 13 or 14-year-old daughter would.
Because it gives her confidence with boys subsequently, doesn't it?
Well, she has knowledge, and then when things start to fall apart in her life, she begins this relationship again with the uncle, and it's a form of control, and it's a struggle for power, and it's a struggle for her to control herself, and it's also a form of revenge, that she makes him do things to her that hurt her, and he doesn't want to, and she makes him do it, and this is her revenge, and also her method of coping with difficult emotions in her life. So for me to write about it in a very visceral, very physical, unforgiving way was really to say, look at this abuse and look at what it does. And it was, you know, to not let people look away, because I think it's easy to discuss abuse in an intellectual way. It's easy to discuss its outcomes and its consequences for the person who has gone through that experience in an intellectual way. But, you know, a part of trying to write it in the way I did was to bond the reader to the girl, so that they can't step away and judge and look from the outside. They can only experience what she experiences. And then later they can decide what they think about that. But in those moments, what I wanted was for them to feel as though they were her.
I think that works brilliantly, not least because of the use of language and how we're in her head, but also it does have a consequence for the reader in that it stays with you. It's not a book that one can forget easily, and I think that in a way is its power. I wonder if you had a sense of the impact it would make on the reader, or whether that was just too far removed for you as a creative writing experience.
Well, no, I mean, I knew what I wanted to happen. I knew what I was trying to achieve. But really, until I had a reader, I didn't know whether that, that had happened, whether it had worked or not. So, I wrote it very quickly. I was full of, these ideas of what I wanted it to do. And then there was 9 years before it was read, and I found out whether it worked or not. So, that was a tricky period.
But people had read it in those 9 years?
Well, my husband and some writer friends had read it, and, they were very enthusiastic about it and very supportive about it, but, that was their job. So I was never sure whether they were, whether I could trust them to be objective about it.
And when the rejection slips started to come, and they did,
oh yes,
were there some rejection slips that had caveats of, yes, we think this is impressive, but?
By and large, I mean, there were some rejections that just said, I don't like it, and that's, that's disappointing, but that's what it is. But a lot of them said, we think this is a very brave book. We think the writing is exciting and interesting and whatever, but we don't know how to sell this book. We don't know how to market this book. Or if it would go a little further, then they would come back and say, no, the marketing department says we don't know how to sell this book. And which was hard. I mean, in some ways it was...
Sorry, I think Mike's gone.
Hello? Mike?
Just give us a second. Try again.
Hello?
No, that's not working. Is yours working?
Oh, yes, I think so.
Okay, let's try and fix that mic, and I'll turn to... Yeah. I'll come back.
Yeah.
Hold the thought. What about your experience of trying to get this book published? Because was it... I mean, it's not as if there aren't precedents for, large historical novels. A lot of what you read in your research focused not just on astrology, but it focused on 19th century Victorian novels such as Wilkie Collins and so on. So it's not as though that part of it was not, there were precedents. But what about the structure? Did people read it and go, because you already had a novel published before this one, it wasn't your first. What did people say? It's very different to your first, I hasten to add.
Well, I was just extraordinarily lucky, in my UK publishers, Granta, allowed me to write the book I wanted to write. And they never once in the process put any kind of financial or kind of market-driven concerns in front of me. They kind of shielded me from all of that. They just let me, they let me do what I wanted to do, I guess, which is quite extraordinary, because I was really asking quite a lot of the publisher. I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, I suppose in a slightly selfish way. I didn't realize that, for example, a long book is very expensive to produce.
I was going to ask about the length. I mean, it's not just about it being produced, but it's about the context that we live in, people's attention spans, whether there is apart from Hilary Mantel's, now trilogy of books on Thomas Cromwell, I wonder about whether they felt that they would have difficulty in actually being able to say, here's an 832-page book. This is one that's going to sell.
I imagine they probably did. I mean, the extraordinary thing was that they just shielded me from all of that. Amazing. The book took me a long time to write. It took about 5 years to write. And from my point of view, it was an experiment that was a failed experiment right up until the end, when finally it worked. I was never sure whether the structure I was going to be able to pull it off. There's kind of various elements to the structure. Another element is that the parts of the book, there are 12 parts of the book, and they halve in length as they go down. So essentially that means part one of the book is half the length of the total length of the book. And that I was completely unsure. I mean, as I was going on, I had to have all sorts of escape plans that I, hoped that I wasn't going to have to use. So it was, I think that actually, from my experience, I didn't ever feel like I was writing a long book. I felt like I was writing an experimental work where the experiment guided me right to the very end, and then the exhilaration at having not had to compromise on any kind of fundamental level on what I wanted for the book was so great that kind of carried me through publication.
The structure that you talk about, the way in which the lengths of each of the chapters is halved every time you get to the end of the next chapter. It's as though it mirrors the waning of the moon. That's the idea, isn't it? So there is a sense by the end of the novel that the novel too has waned away from the reader almost, even though you're utterly engaged in the story. Did you expect that to be a response to it?
Well, no, actually, I was more thinking in terms of pacing than in terms of waning. The sense that very often thrillers or mystery stories do accelerate as they go along. You know, the amount of deaths in the first half of the book is probably not going to be matched by in the last kind of 30, 40 pages. And so in that way I was conscious of trying to build into the structure of a book a kind of an acceleration of excitement. But actually the main interest for me there was to do with giving the reader a sense of a kind of structural integrity that was maybe something quite different than the experience that the characters were having, or indeed that the reader was having of the characters. I was concerned, because it's obviously a Gold Rush book, in questions of predestination and the extent to which we create our own fortunes and our own fates by accepting certain definitions of the world and certain definitions of ourselves. So what I wanted to do is to try and create a book that in one sense seemed predestined, but of course that's a very complicated question, because predestination doesn't make sense when you think about it in the context of a fictional environment, because it's been created, you know, out of nothing.
Well, so exactly. So philosophically, if a story is predestined, does it then change the way that we read it? Because those are the sorts of underlying themes of the novel that you're posing. Right.
But I guess, I mean, the thing with writing a book is that you can always go back and change the beginning. You can also have as much time to write it as you want. You can be changing it right up until the very end. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, actually, with respect to the word democracy, that I think very often gets used to describe works of fiction that are quite fair to all of their characters. You know, they get called democratic, you know, as though the writer has been democratic. It's a slightly strange way to talk about unreal figures, you know.
And yet you want them to be real for the reader. They have to be real. So it's not so strange, I guess.
Right, yeah, it's a bit of a thorny question. Yes, I don't know, I think that it's right that it's paradoxical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I wonder about, in the context of the philosophical notion that you bring up about predestination, I wonder about the consolations of fiction, because many people read fiction, yeah, for all sorts of reasons. You know, you want to be inside somebody's head, and there is a lot about works of fiction which does console. It does either reinforce your sense of your place in the world, or it challenges it. If something is already predestined, which seems to be suggested in the book because of the astrological charts that you're informed by, then what are the consolations of fiction?
Well, I guess I'd say in response to that I think that there's an enormous difference between a stereotype and an archetype. I think that they're almost completely different things. That a stereotype is a person or an experience that has been reduced to its most simple and kind of uncomplicated form, and so therefore completely distorted. And an archetype is something so much greater than an individual person or an individual experience. It's the kind of the shape that hovers behind every instance. It's infinite, really. And so I felt in playing with the archetypes of the heavens that I wasn't really playing with stereotypes at all. That any one writer could have taken the kind of raw data, I suppose, the mathematical data that I had to play with, and could have written a book that was wildly different from the book that I wrote. And I think that for me, there are a great many consolations in symbolism, which is what archetypes are concerned with, I think.
Let's stick with the idea of stereotypes, Eimear, because in your book, if I just listed the things that it is about, which is a single parent in Ireland, although no place is named, but it's quite clear that it is Ireland, a predatory uncle, an abusive parent, on the face of it, these are tropes that we've seen in Irish literature, and yet what makes your book startlingly original is what you choose to do with those particular subject matters, and in particular the church and the blaspheming nature of the girl and how she bucks against what's being rammed down her throat in many instances. Were you nervous about tackling those subjects because for many people they would be perceived as being stereotyped subjects for Irish writers?
Yes, I was. And when I sat down to write the book, I had a different idea in mind, which immediately died because I knew what was going to happen. and I then just had to find my way into the book. And I really thought I don't want to write about, you know, sexual abuse and the church and family and guilt and death and sex, and these are terrible themes for Irish writers. And then found that was all I could write about. So in a way, I had to make my peace with that. And you know, people often ask me, you know, about the idea of the Irish stereotype, and I think, you know, the answer is that those stories are there in our culture. They're part of Irish life. They're part of who we are, and you know, maybe you need to clean out the pipes to get rid of them first. And you know, and no one ever says about you know, English male writers, why are they writing another book about the war? You know, and so, you know, these things are there. But what then became important to me was to try and write about it in a different way.
Yeah.
To try and write about the experience in a different way. And I really felt that, you know, female sexuality is not something that has been examined very well in Irish literature outside of a certain sort of wilting, unhappy, taken advantage of female who is then cast out and struggles and wilts yet more. And I wanted to write about a much more urgent kind of sexuality, about a much more vengeful sexuality, about someone who is attempting to take control of that, to behave in a way that is seen as completely unacceptable by the society that she grows up in, and in many ways by herself because of the way she's been brought up to think about herself. And so it's about trying to find the truth in those things, because they are true. Those stories and those stereotypes are there for a reason.
The other way in which you tackle it in an original way is by injecting humour into it, which is particularly the sections that are to do with the church, which I found, you know, I mean, I laughed out loud in parts, even in the middle of my discomfort and my knowing that I was in her head and feeling her discomfort. Humour seemed to be a very important part of her voice and her personality.
Well, you know, I think she's in a quite an extreme situation, and, you know, the church is quite ridiculous. It appears quite ridiculous in those sorts of situations when you go for consolation, and they really don't understand what the problem is in the first place. And if you had, you know, followed all the rules in the first place, you know, you wouldn't find yourself in this situation. And so, you know, it seems to me the church demands mockery at every turn. And so it was my pleasure to insert some of that into the book.
The relationship between the girl and her brother, who has a brain tumour, that felt incredibly tender, and particularly towards the end when we know that, you know, we know he's dying, and the death, even in the death, she's so rebellious and so blasphemous in that she takes away the sacrament that's been given to him. And that felt like a very powerful act for her against the church, because he'd been given the final sacrament and she takes it away as though it's of no consequence to her because he hasn't sinned. And that felt like you were as the writer, you were actually taking away the absolute fundamentals on which the teachings of the church are based.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, I wanted to write a book about love, but I didn't want to write a book about romantic love. And so, you know, it's a love story between a brother and sister, and I wanted to be released from having to write a romantic story. And you know, at all turns, there's interference in that relationship where the mother constantly, you know, worries around the edges and tries to play them off against each other. And her increasing religiosity as the boy gets iller and iller, you know, poisons a lot of the relationship between the mother and the daughter. And the daughter is very disgusted by the idea that this boy who has grown up living with the, you know, intellectual after effects of a brain tumor should be considered, while he's on his deathbed, to be in a state of sin. And it is disgust for that notion, along with, you know, the idea of original sin that it ties up with. That, you know, made it important to include that in the book.
Let's go back to talking about, before your microphone went dead, about the rejection letters that you were getting. You were telling us about how some of them said, yes, this is brave, but we can't bring ourselves to see how we can sell this. How did that make, what impact did that make on you as the creator of this work? Because you clearly, by this stage, you saw yourself as a writer who was seeking publication.
Well, you know, it was very tricky because it's hard to feel that you're a writer when you're not a published writer, even though that's not true. And I had to
explain why it's not true.
Well, I had to spend 9 years being a failure as a public writer, as a published author, and it made me think very carefully about what it was I was doing and what I wanted. And I understood at a certain point that the book might not get published, might never be published, but that I was still a writer despite that, and that my duty was to keep writing. And so, you know, in those years, I kept writing, which was very difficult and hard to carry the weight of failure and the idea that I might be writing another book for the drawer, to keep that off the work itself. But it really distilled for me the importance to myself of what I was doing and its innate value rather than anything that might come from the outside. And so, you know, in a lot of ways, the book is, you know, the book is successful now, and there's lots of talk about, oh, what will you do next? And whatever way I choose seems to be, there'll be plenty of people waiting to say I made the wrong choice. But I feel actually very insulated by my failure. It keeps the distance very well now that there's success.
It's interesting that this session was titled Early Triumphs, because I suspect that you don't feel that it was an early triumph, given how long you waited.
I feel incredibly old.
Let's talk a little bit about, Eleanor, about the gold rush side of this, because it's clear to me that what setting the book in 1860s Gold Rush allows you to do is to make a comment about greed and about the nature of wealth. And in some respects, you could argue that what you're talking about is capitalism versus the astrology part of the book. Can you just say a little bit about the kind of conscious attempt to do that? Was it a conscious notion that you wanted to be able to say something about capitalism as a system, and greed in particular?
Actually, surprisingly, no. The reason why I went back to the 19th century was simply that I wanted to write a murder mystery. And mysteries depend so much on misinformation. So, you know, the invention of the cell phone was the worst thing that could have ever happened for the mystery novelist. And in fact, we're seeing quite a bit, I think, in the genre of mystery and crime, a move towards a move away from what we would call the detective novel and towards what we would call the crime novel, you know, novels of criminals with pathologies, for example, rather than ingenious situations that a character kind of comes in and can solve like a kind of a board game or like a puzzle. But I really wanted to write that detective novel I just wanted to kind of give it a go. I really enjoy reading detective fiction, and I think it's great fun. So I realized that I needed to go back to a time when communication was fairly difficult, when people could still arrive at a place and miss somebody, could get on the wrong train. One of the things that was in my mind, an ambition for the book from the very beginning, was to have a letter sequence at some point in the book, which I did manage to kind of jimmy in there. One of the things I love about letter sequences, and especially in 19th century fiction, is that it's such a speeded up way of telling a story, because of course the letters are received by the person who didn't write them. And so you can kind of immediately on the discovery of these letters solve quite a lot of plot problems in a short order. But I found actually, as I was starting to write about this world and immerse myself in the language of the era, that my feelings about capitalism in particular started coming to the surface. And now looking back, it doesn't seem like an accident that the global financial collapse happened during the course of my writing the book. You know, pretty much all of my friends who were foolish enough like me to have done arts degrees at university found themselves in this position where they had an enormous amount of student debt, and just the value that their communities was placing on their expertise was just extremely low. And so I think that a lot of that informed the emotional state that I was in when I was writing the book, and therefore kind of informed the values of the book. But it was definitely not an agenda that I had from the beginning.
It's interesting. So you were writing it during 2008, which was when the financial crash happened, or started, the beginning of the financial crisis. So in some ways, what you're saying is that you were informed by everything that was happening around you, and it must have just got in there in a way that perhaps surprised you. Yeah, well, I think that all novels are always speaking to the time in which they're written. You know, I think it would be a mistake to think that because you're writing a book set in the past, you're somehow making a comment, or you're kind of speaking to that past age. I think it's more to do with your present context than it is anything else. And also because of the society that you chose to set the book in, it's dominated by men. The two female characters, Lydia and Anna, are prominent. And in fact, Anna is central to the book. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that as well, because you admitted at the outset that there's no historical accuracy, because there are two Chinese characters in the book as well. And I think the Chinese they weren't present at that time. You've just inserted them slightly earlier. I've brought forward their involvement in the gold rush by 2 years. Yeah, that was one of the ways in which I played with history. For a couple of reasons, both to do with opium, actually. I think that opium, any kind of drug, is wonderful for a mystery novel because it makes people do things that they're not conscious of. It's great desire, and it kind of can contrast nicely with the desire for wealth and so on. So the Chinese characters are the opium providers, and Anna is the addict. Yes. Yeah. Well, I suppose then there's more to it than that as well. That, yeah. I was also interested in the opium wars. Again, kind of speaking to a contemporary context, I think that the behavior of the British during the Opium Wars has a lot in common with the kind of contemporary phenomenon of, for example, a corporation creating a need in their customer base in order for the customers to think that they're getting the relief from their ailment, but actually kind of, they're getting sicker and sicker. And so I was very interested in that, again, in the context of fate. So I brought them forward. But yeah, no, I spent a lot of time thinking about the role of women in the book. My first novel had been predominantly female in terms of the characters, and if I was going to be historically faithful to a certain degree, there was going to have to be very few women, because there were just not that many women in New Zealand at that time, on the side of the settlers at least. But I think that
it's a kind of, again, a slightly thorny question to do with archetypes, that I think that in the Western tradition, in Western culture, we all tend, men and women, I think, to regard the male point of view as a kind of a default, and the female point of view as an exception or a kind of an other. And I think that, strangely, I do this too. You know, if I hear a word like philosopher or thinker, strangely, I think of a man first. And it's not really loaded in any power way, I don't think. But the male perspective seems neutral. And early on, when I was describing my ambition for the book to a friend of mine, he said, you realize that you have 12 characters, and each of whose personality typifies one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Because they're 12 men, you are writing a book about astrology. But if they were 12 women with the same scheme, you would be writing a book about women. And this really bothered me. It was a good criticism to hear, and kind of a good thing to grapple with. And I feel like I'm still grappling with it in a way. I wish that weren't the case, but I think that we kind of, understanding the female perspective as one that is a kind of a default perspective is actually one that takes quite a lot of effort, I find, in my own life. And I think that we need to make that effort.
A good moment for me to pause at the very least and turn it over to you in the audience. Can you wait until you have a microphone in your hand? So put your hands up if you'd like to ask a question. A hand's gone up just there in the center. Yeah, the lady with the green top on.
Hi, this is a question for Eleanor Catton. I was really blown away by the vocabulary in your novel, and I was wondering what sort of literature did you read growing up to be able to write a book like this?
Oh, well, I was very lucky growing up. My mum was a children's librarian when I was growing up, so that's kind of the best thing for a mum to be. And really, just everything that I could get my hands on, really. But I've continued to read children's literature right into my adult life, and I still read it now. I have such a respect for children's literature. I think it's such a pure form of storytelling where showing off is not allowed and self-indulgence is not allowed. It's all about giving an experience to the reader, like you were talking about before. So the books that I credit with having given me a kind of a joy of reading and a joy of writing are all books for children and continue to be.
There's a hand gone up just here in the front.
Hi, Eleanor.
And then perhaps, do we have more than one microphone? Perhaps we can get one right to the back there. Somebody just put their hands up there. Yeah, great.
Hi,
Hi, the title of the book, The Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, suggests strong feminist notion. Were you conscious about the feminist side of the book? Were you trying to write a feminist book?
I didn't set out with that in mind. I wasn't interested in trying to make any kind of political point. I was interested in trying to tell a story as truthfully as I could, and that hopefully in that people would then think about the various issues of the book. And more in hindsight, and more since the book has been published and I've been talking about it, it seems to me a very feminist book. But I can't claim that I set out to write it in that vein.
Has the person right at the back got a microphone? And then perhaps we could get a microphone to the gentleman here in the front.
Yeah, so my question is to Eleanor. So the question is, you were writing within a specific genre, but still experimenting with the structural form. So how far were you prepared to sacrifice the traditions of the genre?
That's a great question. Throughout the whole writing process, I knew that if I ever had to choose between story and structure, that the story would win. And in fact, I have cut a few corners at certain places in the book, just interpreted things as it suited the story rather than kind of very strictly working within the parameters of the structure. I think it's because I feel that, I mean, you mentioned before this importance of giving the reader a good time, or kind of keeping the reader's experience of the book front and center, and not demanding without promising, you know, a reward of some kind. And that was very much how I was operating as well. You know, I think that as each year passes, just, you know, hundreds of thousands more books are published. There's so much more for every individual reader to read. As we become more globally connected, that's even more true. And I think that, you know, what this means is that you have to respect your readers' time in a way that maybe wasn't true even 200 years ago. You also have to respect, I think, the growing diversification of your readership, that somebody is going to read your book who knows quite a bit about your subject matter, and somebody is going to read your book who knows absolutely nothing about your subject matter, and you have to kind of give both those readers a good time in whatever way you can.
Hi, my question is to Eleanor.
Sorry, I can't. Who's got the microphone? Somebody got the microphone?
Here, and in the back. Yeah, okay. My question is to Eleanor. I read an interview of yours somewhere in which you've said that you read a book which was very structurally ornate, and you wish that you could, you know, somebody could combine an ornate structure with an active plot, which you've managed to do. So what does it take to do that? You know, how did you manage to do that? And another thing which you said was that the writing of this book changed you. So in what way did it change you? These are the things that I want to know. Thank you.
Well, I think that structure, or maybe form is a better word to use than structure, is not at all separate from content. I think that you can't really separate how somebody says something from what they say. How they say it and what they say are part of the same package, and you can, after the fact, you can separate them and you can kind of talk about them independently, but you can't ever experience one without the other. So I'd say that I think that it's very important for the form to match the content, for them to be in agreement in some way. For me, because I was interested in questions of fate and fortune and that kind of thing, the archetypes that I was using and the systems that I was using made sense with the subject matter. But I don't think that I would have ever, I don't think I'll ever write a book like this again, if that makes sense. And I don't know if I'd be able to even generalize about how to make form and content match. I don't know whether you'd be able to, maybe I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
No, I mean, I agree that the two things are intrinsic, absolutely intrinsic. And it seems to me that you know, when you separate them out, it becomes an exercise that makes the reader have to do all the work instead of the writer having to do all the work. And it's much more pleasurable when they work in tandem together.
Thank you.
Gentleman in the front.
Yeah, hi. My question is for Eleanor. I have recently read your book, The Rehearsal, and I was very fascinated by the way you take a reader to the journey in that book. I have two questions, actually. The first one is about The Rehearsal. What kind of a research do you do? Because the theatre that you have spoken about and the music that you have spoken about seems like you have really researched the topic. So how much time do you dedicate to a research? And my second question is really around the second book, which is 832 pages. I'm wondering about the editing process and the number of times you've had to read that 832 pages and how formidable that is and how strenuous that can be. So, so those two questions for you.
Oh, you'd have to ask him on the second question, I think. I think that reading is about 90% of the writer's job. And my process when I work is to read as much as I can in the early stages of a project and take just an absurd amount of notes. So with The Rehearsal, my first book, I read actually mostly plays and dramatic theory and theatre manifestos and that kind of thing, and just literally just copied out everything that delighted me from what I was reading. Ended up with this kind of big bank of knowledge that then I was able to kind of feel like I had a firm place to stand. My favorite etymology, the etymology I really like, is the etymology of the word author, which comes from the Latin word to increase, augere, to increase. And I like the sense that, if you're a true author, you're not just replicating things that already exist in the world, but you're adding to them. And I find that in my own experience or in my own process, I have to get to a certain point where I feel like I know enough about the subject in order to be able to add to it. But yeah, I mean, the editorial experience that I had on the Luminaries was very personal, actually. It was more personal than anything else. I sent batches, kind of parts of the book off to London at various points during the writing and accompanied them with lists of questions for that I was asking of the work, that then I would converse with my editor about, and we'd kind of tackle them together. I think that conversation is really important. I think that in my life, talking about my work with other people is so important for me to find out what I actually think about it. Actually, a friend of mine said to me as a joke that I had written most of my first book in interviews, because I would say, oh, my second book's about this, long before it was finished, and then think, oh, okay, well, that sounds good, and then would go off and kind of insert that into the book.
And also just to tell people that part of the money that you won for the Man Booker Prize, you've set up an award for people to apply for, to read, budding writers, in order to give them time to read, such as your commitment to that process, which is pretty impressive. I think we've got time for one probably more question. Where's the mic? I've got a hand here in the front, and you appear to have a microphone.
Thank you. This is for Eimear. Could you speak about whether you considered self-publishing while you were waiting to publish?
No, I didn't. At the time, which was, in sort of mid-2000s, it was still considered quite taboo, I suppose, if you wanted to be taken seriously. It was still called vanity publishing, and it was before it had really taken off in the way that it has nowadays. So I didn't consider it for those reasons then. But also, I think with the nature of the book, the way the book is written, I felt that it needed some kind of stamp of approval, actually, because the internet is full of crazy books written by people like myself, probably in ways just like myself, and actually it needed somebody to stand behind it and say, we think you should try this book. We think you should give it a go. And so I think even if I was in that position now, I still wouldn't have considered self-publishing. And I think self-publishing works much better for things like genre fiction, where people can just they like the plot or they don't. Whereas with a book like mine, they maybe need a little more time to work out what they think about it.
We've come to the end of our session. Thank you all very much for your questions and your attention, and thank you both to Eimear McBride and Eleanor Catton.
Thank you.
Yes, and if we could have thanks once again for the authors Eleanor Catton, Eimear McBride and Razia Iqbal, who moderated the session brilliantly. If you'd like to meet the authors, they're just going to be at the signing tent here very shortly. Can we also give a very special thanks for our sponsor for the event, which was UN Women. Thank you.